you done now?
As they said in the film, Back to the Future, where we're going, we don't need roads.
Oh, Brad, what have you done now?
Wait a minute, Doc. Are you telling me you built a time machine? Out of a DeLorean?
My calculations are correct. When this baby hits 88 miles per hour, you're gonna see some serious shit. Next Saturday night, we're sending you back to the future.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast, the only podcast looking back in time at the greatest film trilogy of all time, Back to the Future. I am your friend in time, Brad Gilmore, and today we have a very special show. Part one of my conversation with Scott Corelli and Nick Jimenez of Back to the Future Minute. Back to the Future Minute, for those of you who might not know, they just wrapped up their series, but they broke down each Back to the Future film 1 minute at a time. 1 minute at a time. I mean, imagine. It was a daily show, 5 shows a week, you know, extra shows on the weekend, just an insane amount of Back to the Future coverage. And these guys were dedicated, man. I appeared on one of the episodes, kind of. My internet connection was real wonky, but former co-host Norman Binford held it down for Back to the Future, the podcast. And it was a cool experience to even, attempt that. But this is part one. We talk about not just their podcast. We talk about a lot of things. We talk about some theories from the movies that I've never discussed with anybody else. And we have some really interesting conversations and discussions. So check it out. This is part one of my conversation with the guys from Back to the Future Minute, Scott Corelli and Nick Jimenez. Enjoy. Scott and Nick join me right now. Guys, how are y'all doing?
Good, Brad. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Nick, how's everything over there in La La Land?
Doing very well. Thanks so much for having us.
Hey, I'm excited to talk to y'all. Back to the Future Minute, y'all just finished your final episodes here just last week or the week before. You went to the Chi. You went to Chicago to record your final show. Isn't that right?
Yes.
How was that? How was that? I'm getting ready to do my first live podcast here in a couple weeks. So I want to know, how was it? Was it everything you hoped it would be?
I loved the experience. I thought it was really fun. I've never done anything like that before. Nick has done kind of similar stuff to that.
Yeah, I guess that's true. You have a little bit less public speaking, I guess, or like audience work, I guess. Right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah. Well, because I've done like plays and stuff, but not as many.
You have.
Yeah,
you've been. I've always loved telling people this. You've been the lead in a play before recently, not even like in high school.
Right. Yeah. But I've never done like one of our podcasts live. But you've done that. That's sort of I forget what it's called, but that Mystery Science Theater kind of thing that you do in LA occasionally. What is that, Nick?
Say it one more time.
The Mystery Science Theater thing that you do.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's called, so I'm a part of something called Wonder Crust, which it started actually in Texas, like Arlington, Fort Worth. And it's basically Mystery Science Theater 3000, but we edit, I say we like I do it, but there are edited jokes and bits edited into the footage. It kind of like is meant to recapture that feeling of like channel surfing, which I guess it's kind of a lost art. I didn't really think about it, but we kind of the way like Beavis and Butthead channel surfed is kind of an extinct pastime, I think.
Yeah.
So like something will remind us of something from like Wayne's World, and we'll edit in a clip from Wayne's World. And yeah, so we've done it like 3 or 4 times in LA, and that's always really fun because performing's fun. Performing in front of a crowd is cool, and when that crowd is mostly made up of people who already know the show and know you, it's that much more of a blast.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I can only imagine. I only imagine it's a rush. You know, I've done live performance, but never a live podcast, so I'm looking forward to it. But y'all broke down Back to the Future, the ride, and I have so many questions to get to y'all about it, and so much Back to the Future to talk. But let's start there. Back to the Future, the ride. I never got to ride it. I believe it was Scott. It was your story when you were there with a kid, and you were too scared to get on the ride initially. Is that right?
Yeah, that was me. My dad was very upset because he was very excited to ride the ride, and he actually ended up riding it without me, and then that's how I was introduced to the Back to the Future trilogy. Was after that he was like, "Look, it's not scary. Look at this dork like that gets blown back because he turns the speaker on too loud. It's not a scary ride." So yeah, it was but as like a 6 or 7 year old, the prospect of being eaten by a dinosaur and spit back out was a terrifying one, to say the least.
It's a lot to ask of a kid, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, the concept, it might be a little much for a 7-year-old to digest. But, I've always heard people, and, I had Stephen Clark on this podcast who runs BackToTheFuture.com. A lot of people, though, regard the ride as the fourth film almost, like the continuation of the series. Is that where y'all both kind of stand? Because I'll be honest with you, it kind of more feels like, I don't know, like, that animated series that's just kind of suspended in its own reality almost. It is a continuation, but it's kind of not. Where do you kind of feel, Scott, where do you feel? Do you think that it's a fourth film?
Not a fourth film per se, but I do consider it, as goofy as it is, I consider it part of continuity just because it's the first Back to the Future thing that I was exposed to. So it feels important in my fan brain, even if it's technically not even remotely important.
And it's, well, finish your thought and I'll go.
No, that was it. Go ahead.
Well, I just, I'm thinking it's so, you are such a, because of the podcast, Back to the Future Minute, and you were seen as an authority on Back to the Future, if nothing else, after all of this friggin' weird stuff that we've been doing. But what I think is so great about the point is there's no wrong way to enter a fandom. There's no incorrect way to get interested in something. I mean, I'm sure there are some purists that are like, oh, you watched the ride before part one. Doesn't that, because like, isn't that what parents do? They get so like, oh, but he has to see it this way because that's how I did it. And if it's the wrong way, he won't love it like I did. I mean, that seems like a geek dad problem. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. Sure.
And so, there are probably like kids now that are going to go on the Guardians ride before seeing any of the Guardians movies. And like, that's okay too,
Yeah, that's true.
Or kids going into Star Wars land and never, seen any of the, episode 4.
Right? Yeah. Or like there's a kid out there who just has seen Attack of the Clones first. And that's like the first Star Wars movie he ever saw.
Yeah. Well, I feel bad for that child. That's an awful way to start everything out. But, I've watched the ride footage. I never got to ride the ride, but, I think it was included in one of the, Back to the Future Blu-ray releases, like the 30th anniversary, the 25th anniversary, one of those. And, it's cool, and I've seen clips on YouTube of people riding the ride or whatnot, but I don't think that it's not for me. It doesn't feel like it's a part of, I know it's the same universe, but it doesn't feel like it. I guess, when they go back to the Jurassic Park, or Jurassic part of the ride, I should say, that's where I feel like it just kind of gets out there for me.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. I think I said as much in our final episode that the going to the 2015 is fun and exploring that and chasing Biff through that. But when you go to the Ice Age and the Cretaceous period, it's not, that's not Back to the Future, so it feels weird. But like, I also understand that they spent so much money making that 2015 miniature that I think they were trying to save money by making ice blocks and lava blocks and just, it's like, yeah, no. And then this happens. It's fine. And there's a dinosaur, like whatever. Cause I mean, really the science doesn't even check out. Like, how do you go to BC using the DeLorean, time circuits? Like that doesn't, there's no BC settings. So like, how do you even go back that far? So I don't know. But it's I like it. And I will say that watching the footage on its own is a much different experience than being there. I don't really even know how to describe what it was like to ride that ride, because I probably rode the ride at least a dozen times, because I think every time after that first time I would ride it at least twice every time I went to Universal. And like I told you off mic before, I lived in Florida for a while, so I went to Universal a lot. So I ended up riding that ride probably about a dozen times all told. And it was just the whole experience is just really fun. Like it's one thing to watch that stuff online, but to actually like be there and experience it is very different. But I would never get upset with anyone who would say like, I don't think that's part of canon. I can't argue that. Like that's fine. It's a ridiculous thing, this ride. And it's not made by, either Bobby Z or Bobby G. Like they have nothing to do with it. Like they wrote it when it was done. Like that's all they did. So, it is what it is. And I accept it and I love it. But I came into the franchise through it. So I probably have a more fond sort of nostalgic feeling for it than a lot of people do.
I 100% understand that, because the first Bond movie I ever saw was Die Another Day, and by all accounts, it's one of the worst ones ever. But I have a special fondness for it in my heart. You know what I've always wondered, though, is you touched on it for a second there, Scott, and Nick, I want you to weigh in on this. And this doesn't really have to do with Back to the Future, but you talked about how they spent a lot of money on that 2015 miniature. I would like to say an sort of an amateur theme park enthusiast. I love Disney. I'm more of a Disney guy. But what I've always wanted to know is, how do they figure out how much money to allocate to a certain ride? Like, how much money can they spend on it? Like, I understand it from a movie perspective. Let's spend $100 million on this movie. We, project we're going to get $350 million. But I've never understood the model. And I don't know if either one of y'all know, but what is the model for allocating money to a ride? And how do they figure out they're going to get that money back?
It is the amount of people that the ride can churn out per hour. So the more people it can churn out, the more expensive the ride can be.
Oh, really? So that's how they figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And Back to the Future, I think y'all mentioned that. So Back to the Future does how many people per? The Back to the Future ride did how many people per hour?
1,300, I think. 1,300 an hour.
Holy hell. That's a pretty efficient ride.
Yeah. It was pretty efficient. I think it had a huge budget, but I think they blew most of it on that 2015 section. That miniature was intricate.
Yeah.
It also ends very abruptly. I mean, Doc's like, all right, and we're done. Get out of here. Go. And you've been congratulated. Yo, you stopped it. How great. You're my best friend forever. And then, like, it ends. And I remember being like, oh, okay.
Well, to me, that's like the hang up about most theme park rides. I feel like when they end, it's like immediate. There's no it's even like in a water slide. It's fun, and then there's an abrupt ending, and that's it.
Right.
You've waited for an hour for an abrupt ending.
Right. There's no third act to
no.
Park rides. That's not a thing.
None at all. It's not a thing. So off the ride, let's go back to the beginning, and I guess, Nick, this would be my question for you: is where did this Back to the Future minute idea come from? Now, I've heard of the Star Wars minute and all those minute podcasts, but why Back to the Future, and why were you and Scott the right ones to do it?
I was walking out of, I was seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey at the Music Box, so I was in a pretty good mood already. And as I was turning my phone back on, I got some texts from Scott, and they were pretty direct. It was just like, hey, I had been aware of Star Wars Minute through Scott. He had been talking about it since, like, I want to say like 2012 was when you first started listening. Whenever it started was when you first started listening to it, I think. Mm-hmm. And he was like, hey, I want to do that, but Back to the Future. I got the blessing from the Star Wars Minute guy, so we're not going to be like ripping them off in a bad way, not in an underhanded way. And honestly, this sounds hella cheesy, but I don't know. Scott and I are both super we love chewing on an idea. We love throwing it back and forth. And a negative side of that is sometimes a project won't move forward for a while. But I just really trusted how direct he was. And he was like, we can do this. I can get the Twitter profile and all. And he was just already so down that I was like, I have no idea what this is or even why this would work, but I just trust his conviction.
Does that sound about right to you, Scott?
I mean, yeah, it was a thing where, Back to the Future has been my favorite movie of all time for as long as I can remember. And there was no other option. I mean, there were lots of options for what we would do after Back to the Future if we wanted to do another one afterward. But to me, first and foremost was I want to do Back to the Future, basically because I didn't want anyone else to do it. Yeah. I was like, no. Like, I want to do it. Like, I have all of these talking points that I want to talk about. And I would be afraid that someone would have a dry take on it or something that wouldn't match the tone of the movie. Because I think if Nick and I did anything, I think that we made a podcast that feels like it's made for the movies that we're talking about. I think that the tone of the show matched the movies for the most part. I think occasionally, especially in the alternate 1985 stuff, it got pretty dark there for a while. But I'm really proud of the work that we did on that show, and I think it just came down to like when I found out that the Star Wars Minute guys were up for other people doing it. I had already been dreaming of doing a Back to the Future Minute, but then I was like, I can't just rip off Star Wars Minute. I can't do that. And then when they were like, yeah, no, you can totally rip us off, I immediately sent them, like I was listening to the podcast where they said that, and I paused it, went over to my Gmail and shot them an email. I want to do Back to the Future Minute. And they sent back some stipulations, and I was in, and then I immediately got the Twitter handle and sent away to Kevin Ziegler, my artist friend, for the artwork for the podcast and all of these things, and then sent Nick the text and was like, hey, would you want to do this? Because I really want to do this, and I don't know anyone else who would be crazy enough to do this with me. So,
so yeah, you were more the bigger fan of the series. Would that be safe to say, or no?
He wouldn't say it, so I will. Like, absolutely, I would feel weird saying that I'm as much of a fan of Back to the Future as Scott, just because I've come to Back to the Future was sort of something that I came to really love when I was a teenager. It wasn't something that I was aware of it, and I had seen them on HBO, but I remember when I was like 13, 14, watching Back to the Future and being like, oh wait, this is perfect. This is like everything I kind of want to do with movies, because it's big and it's about emotions more than plot, and it's also like universal. And I just think that's so interesting that it's this big movie that everyone knows, and you don't have to be a nerd to like it. You don't have to be a smart person to like it. You can be anyone and like Back to the Future, and yet it's so smart. And that's always been really interesting to me. I've become a bigger fan coming out of the show, because now I have an emotional attachment I didn't really have before. Doc and Marty feel like characters that belong to me now, the way that like Han Solo does, or the way like Indiana Jones does.
No, I understand that. I understand that completely. And, I think, I'm the same way. I was a massive fan of the Back to the Future Back to the Future trilogy my, whole life. But, once you start doing the show, when you get involved in anything, you start appreciating different aspects that you didn't realize were there when you start looking at it and being analytical of it. And I think that does endear you to the story, to the characters more. Now, I've always wondered this, because Back to the Future, there's a documentary that's about Back to the Future on Netflix, Back in Time. Jason Aaron, who's been on this show before, directed it. In that, someone says Back to the Future is a perfect movie. And Scott, I'll start with you. Do you agree that Back to the Future is a perfect movie?
The first one,
The first one.
absolutely 100%. Yeah, 100%. It's a perfect movie.
How is that?
Because you can bounce a dime off that movie. Like there isn't a plot thread in that movie that isn't tied up perfectly. Like every setup gets a payoff. There's just no fat on that piece of meat. Like there's just nothing. Like it is just a absolute perfect movie. I don't even know how to describe it. It's so lean. The characters have great arcs. Like it's the plot is good. The stakes are great. Like everything about it. The music is perfect. It is full. Like just spilling over with iconic moments. I mean, it's an absolute top to bottom perfect movie.
Nick?
Yeah, it's just so, as a writer, it's a difficult movie to top. And I think that's why when you talk to filmmakers, it tends to be in their top like 5 or 4, like Edgar Wright and direct. If you know how difficult it can be to design a story and tell a story effectively and tell a movie that isn't just all fat and useless stuff, it's like when other was Salieri, listening to Mozart and Amadeus, like you're just like, what? How does he do it? And I could never convince someone that their favorite movie, because Back to the Future cannot be everyone's favorite movie, and there are some things. I guess if you want to take out of the equation of it being designed perfectly, I guess it doesn't pass the Bechdel test, and that kind of sucks. But in terms of how it's designed and how it's written and how it accomplishes telling a story, it's definitely. I don't think Scott and I have worked on a script that has an organically brought up Back to the Future, like in terms of trying to get more inspiration out of it.
Mm-hmm.
No, yeah, I mean, I'm on the side of it. It's a perfect movie, even though I think the one thing people point out, I want to get your analysis of this. The one thing people point out is it maybe not being perfect is that there's no character arc for Marty McFly. People argue that he hasn't learned anything. Although I think you might be able to make that argument that he did learn something. I don't know. He learned about time travel. But what do you think? What do you think, Scott? Do you think that that's a fair criticism that there was no story arc for Marty, so therefore, your protagonist didn't evolve in any kind of way, so that kind of prohibits it from being perfect?
I understand people's criticism of that, and it's certainly not a choice that I would do. I would argue that he does have an arc. It's just a really
Weak.
small one. Yeah,
it's just kind of, when you look at a movie like, or just, if you look at a story like A Christmas Carol, which is another one of my favorite stories and also has time travel. Like Ebenezer Scrooge is a completely different man from the beginning and ending of that story in very broad, defined, big ways. And Marty McFly, and I say this with all the love in my heart, isn't Hamlet. He isn't even like Harry Potter, or he's just kind of like a dumb kid, and I really love that about him. So to those people I would say absolutely, Marty doesn't have the arc that Ralph does, or but I liken him more to a character like Ferris Bueller or Cher Horowitz, or even Cher Horowitz learned some lessons at the end. But there's this great adage, I think it was about Ferris Bueller, where the world is changed by him, he doesn't change the world.
Right. And
Marty kind of is this avatar of you, and he kind of, his favorite band is Huey Lewis and the News. He's kind of basic.
What I like though, what I think his arc in that movie is he's not. I mean, it's basically
he accepts family. Yeah,
I would argue that he's the most 80s character in cinema. because his entire arc is that there's nothing wrong with me. I'm going to change everyone else.
That's true.
Yeah, that's what his thing is like he feels out of place at the beginning of that. He's like, I don't understand my family. And then when, he meets his new family at the end of the movie, he's like, oh, okay, now this I can get into. And that's
I fixed them.
Yeah, I fixed them. Like now my life is what I wanted it to be. Like it really is. Marty's not happy with his life, and he ends the movie happy with his life. That is a very small, very selfish character arc, but that's what makes him the perfect 80s character, because that was the 80s in a nutshell.
And we've had a lot of fun towards the end of the podcast poking fun at what the movie's definition of like better is. It's yes, Lorraine and George are genuinely happy and genuinely in love, but the fact that the movie seems to imply that that happiness is intrinsically linked with monetary success and career success it's just so not what we're being told right now in 2017, in the age of like love yourself and like avocado toast and shit. It's just it hasn't aged poorly. It's just aged very weird.
Right.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. And then at the same aspect, you could also argue that them being financially more secure and stable and having, being more wealthy and more healthy could just be a byproduct of George, a happy accident in a sense. It's just a byproduct of George standing up for himself, becoming a man at an early age, and learning
not settling for a mundane life or an unhappy life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so you can argue that that although I see the superficiality of it and why people make that argument, at the same time, it's still, I just think it's a byproduct of what George's character arc was.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I mean, but aside from that, so when you started though the podcast, to go back to it now, you're going through minute by minute, and sometimes you have that great opening scene which has a lot of detail and you can go through it a lot. There's a lot to pick apart. There's the safety last references, to the actor Lloyd and all that stuff. But there are a few minutes in Back to the Future and definitely in the sequels where there's not a lot going on. Right? I mean, it's just literally a scene of I don't even know, just not a lot going on. Even if it's a Marty skateboarding through Hill Valley, in the beginning, there's just not a lot of meat on that bone. So how did y'all figure out how to get, because every episode was at least a half hour or more. And so how would y'all pick apart, 1 minute of something that's not really, there's not a lot of meat on the bone and bring it to a half hour episode where it's a full analysis of this? How were y'all able to do that?
I mean, I can't tell you. I honestly, Nick obviously comes from an improv background, so that certainly helps. But I don't know. We're just, it feels like we kind of just got it right away, and we're just like, even in the drier stuff, we would find things to just send us down a trajectory of discussion about these characters, and like, I wonder what they were doing before this, or how did they get from here to here, and what happened between there, and I don't know. Like we always found something, and I can't tell you what the magic sauce is. I just know that I never worried. Like even when my notes were only even if I only had 2 or 3 notes going into a minute, I knew we would get at least 20 minutes out of it every time. I never worried.
Yeah, in some ways, it's kind of the job that I've been preparing for my whole life, which is like my comfort zone is hanging out with my friends, whether we're watching something or at a diner or in a car and just talking. And I really am a child of Kevin Smith, not literally that I know of, but like we're all kind of aware of the beauty of conversation. I mean, that's why we listen to podcasts. To go back to the very beginning, that Superman Returns podcast that Scott was talking about, that was the first one of his I listened to. And I just remember thinking like, oh, I wish this was a guy that I had like with me to talk to in the cafeteria. And I think on a deep level, that's that's a beauty of what podcasts can be, particularly to people that are not living in super geek friendly parts of the world or the country. I was that person that would listen to podcasts in the cafeteria when I was in high school, and I hadn't found my tribe yet, So talking is what Scott said about there not being any fear, I think is very true. I was never worried about it.
To clarify something Nick just said, when he said the Superman Returns podcast I was talking about earlier, he's actually referencing something we said in another recording that we did earlier today.
Oh, God damn it.
I was like, what Superman Returns podcast? Well, whatever.
Yeah.
Well, no. You said when you, that's right. Yeah. When you were doing Superman Returns, you were like, oh yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
That was,
I don't even know why I'm saying her name. That's not for anyone but you and me. But like, I guess I just, we just always, because Scott's so analytical and I'm, I do have that improvisation background. And I think that cocktail just really lent itself to the quote drier moments.
No, definitely. Well, hey, this is Scott Corelli and Nick Jimenez from Back to the Future Minute. More with them back in a second.
Oh, Brad, what have you done now? Oh, Brad, what have you done now?